Okay, thanks for coming to the second seminar in the semester. Today we have Julian Roche talking about exports of dry fruits from Uzbekistan. He is an adjunct with us, although many of you might not have seen him before. So the floor is yours.
Coming, and thank you for zooming in on this or teaming in or whatever you're going to do. Yes, I'm here to talk about Uzbek dried fruit exports, and I thought I would just start by just providing some reason as to why I'm here talking about dried fruit exports, because it's not the most immediate subject that we would think about. I've been associated with UNCTAD off and on as a consultant now for 30 years. So I was pleased when they were starting to think about putting together a project on landlocked countries and the possibilities for export and landlocked countries.
If you are going to be here.
For landlocked countries. So they've done a number of papers on this subject, fostering exports of maize from Laos and so forth. All of these papers, by the way, are available on the UNCTAD website, UNCTAD.org. So if anyone wants to pursue related stuff, I've cannibalized some of my colleagues' PowerPoints as well as my own here. But all of these PowerPoints are available, and the main documents that have come out from this, the Laos document, and indeed this document. So different commodities, different countries was the idea. And in particular, this one, they decided to work on dried fruits from Uzbekistan. They looked for somebody to do internal consultancy inside of Uzbekistan. So they found somebody to go and do that. And I'll be referring to his work on field studies a little bit later on. And then they wanted somebody to do the number crunching and the analysis of the export markets and conclusions to be drawn about the international aspect of it. And they picked on me. So it's a combination. This presentation is a combination of the two different people's work. And I should also mention my colleague Rodrigo at UNCTAD, who coordinated it and who was responsible for the Laos maize paper. He's absolutely marvelous and a source of tremendous source of information about international trade and particularly trade in commodities. So this work took place last year and culminated in a presentation in February to the, obviously online, to the Uzbek government with the World Bank present and others. We attempted to, and I think we have convinced everyone of the logic that this presentation leads to. But it is the logic of the policy implications that I invite you to consider as we go through this, to see if you agree with me and see whether you think that it's a question of whether the policy recommendation is right or whether we are simply dealing with questions of implementation. And that's, I think, where the debate goes. Okay, so let me going if I can. Can I just go to slideshow and continue from there?
Yep.
I guess I've got about 35 minutes or so to speak, and then if anyone wants any questions and so forth, I'll give it up. I'll try not to go on too long. All right, so starting perhaps with a little bit of the statistical background as where we are. So when we think about international trade like this, we, anyway, from an UNCTAD standpoint, tend to look at exports and exporting countries on the one hand, and then importing countries on the other. I well remember that USDA, Vernon Rogan, who used to do the modeling at USDA, told me many years ago that when everyone had a country inside USDA, they would all model their countries. And when they added up everyone's models, national models at the end of the day, it was completely unsurprising that exports were always about 15% greater than imports. Now, of course, you can't have that. So what they did was they let everyone rip, and then they lowered all the export expectations down to match the imports, because of course the model has to match. Here, the statistics are drawn from the ITC database. And during COVID, the ITC database was made free for everyone for a long period of time, which was marvelous, although I would have got it through UNCTAD anyway. But the ITC trade database will go down to a certain level of disaggregation, free of charge. But if you want to get down to the level of things like dried apples and dried prunes, then you probably need a subscription unless you can get the information from somewhere else. So this is it. And it should be the big story, I think, immediately, is that this is a tale of two markets. There are dried grapes, and then there is everything else. And you can see, I think most of you probably will have come across dried grapes in the multiplication forms, sultanas, raisins, currants, and so on. But increasingly, if you go to supermarkets all over the world, you will also find packets of dried fruit, which will contain my beloved apricots and prunes and others as well. And that's how the market divides up generally. So you see that the others were all sorts of things in there, pomegranates and so forth. Dried apricots are a very significant element of the whole exercise, and then you've got prunes. So these are the big value markets, and then everything else falls together, including mixtures. If we look at who's importing, the UK is the biggest importer of dried fruits. There's been a lot of health motivation behind eating these things. In moderation, dried fruits are good for you, and I encourage you to consume them. In excess, like anything else, they're not very good for you. But that goes for anything, of course, including water that I poisoned myself in Panama with a few years ago. So if you look at the main importers, it's pretty clear where the big activity still is. If you add up the European Union imports together, you're seeing a vast quantity. So dried fruits predominantly at the moment is a European import market. Now, anybody importing anything to Europe, and immediately you realize that you're confronting European Union regulations, right? That's the first thing that should go up in your mind when you think about importing to the European Union. Not how far away is it, and how do I get there, and so on. But what are the regulations? So you can also, but this is a snapshot from 2019, and it doesn't show rates of growth. And if we were to look at rates of growth in the marketplace, we would see a somewhat different story. And in particular, we would see that other countries, Russian Federation notably, which is moving into being a European-style country in terms of consumption, India and China, particularly, where dried fruit imports, despite the fact that China manufactures its own excellent dried fruits, China is a great new growing market for imports of dried fruit. And of course, with the new Silk Road policies and so forth, Belt Road initiatives, they're quite keen to see that kind of trading relationship open up inside Asia, where Uzbekistan happens to be. If we look at exports, we see a very different story. We see a giant bestriding the dried fruit export market of the world. And that market, that giant waves a red and white flag, and that giant is Turkey. And if you look at academic publications, and I know you all have an interest in this, if you look at academic publications on questions of quality, questions of phytosanitary, questions of all the technical issues associated with it, you find that Turkish academics are really close with the Turkish dried fruit export market. And that's as well because it's a really important part of Turkish agricultural exports. Fruit in general, but dried fruits in particular. US follows up, but then it all starts, right? Rice, tobacco, wherever you go, you find the US is the major agricultural exporter. And those are the main ones that you actually see. A lot of these will be re-exports of one variety or another. And that's why it's difficult to take the ITC figures absolutely, particularly when dealing with Kazakhstan and possibly even, dare I suggest it, Turkey as well. I spoke to a dried fruit processor and retailer in a certain country not very far away from us. I said, these dried fruits that you put out with Turkish source of origin, Turkey, are always from Turkey. There's a long silence at the end of the line. Where does Uzbekistan send its exports to? Well, there you can see Kyrgyzstan, a large quantity of exports going there. China, a major export destination, and Turkey. Well, why would Turkey need to import dried fruits from Uzbekistan? Can't imagine why that might be, except when you look at climatic variations in Turkey and you see that in fact there are bad seasons and good seasons. And if you correlate, as of course we did, the level of imports of dried fruits from Uzbekistan to Turkey with the seasonality of Turkish dried fruit production, you get a picture as to what's really going on. Other countries as well, and significant growth, as we will see in countries like the United Arab Emirates, which is importing a lot from everywhere these days. So this is your value and share. And when we now look at, the sign is over there, but can you guess what the green is? A big clue, you know, they come in green and red. That's great. And thank you very much. And when you now look at this, I think that's brilliant. If you look at it, you can now see that if the market generally is divided into two, the Uzbek export market is dominated already by dried grapes. I mean, everything else is pretty much of an also rare in Uzbekistan, frankly. And if we all know our principles of comparative advantage, this is the theme that we're going to start developing. And we can see that in addition, though, there are still these interesting and important markets for dried prunes and dried apricots, which, of course, from a value-added point of view, are very attractive for those people who produce them. So that's what Uzbekistan is up to in terms of its own exports. And I'm using 2019 data because it shows a trend upwards. For obvious reasons, 2020 is probably very difficult to generalize from. Data is coming out, but it's really tricky to do anything with 2020 data everywhere. And I think that if you look at, and I know that, if you look at the long-term trends, 2019 is pretty representative of where we're at. So that's your dried grape imports. Once again, US leading, same kind of story with China significantly down here at the moment. But again, showing an upward trend so far as imports are concerned. Here's the back data. This is the rate of growth, and although I haven't put it all into a graph, you can sort of see the way that we're going. And look at that growth in the Russian Federation in 4 years. And it's on its way up with dried grape imports quite substantially. Other markets, relatively solid markets that are fairly neutral in their growth patterns, but others showing relatively rapid growth. Some mature, some not so mature. And look at that Indian growth as well, really quite dramatic. And I'm very familiar over the many, many years I've seen graphs like this, the things that look like a dramatic increase from 2015 to 2019. When you go back and look at them from 2050 to 2015, you see that they went up a little bit like that at the early stage, and then they're way up there 30 years later. The whole market is transformed. So there's an enormous, I think, there's an enormous amount of potential in the dried fruit market, particularly given the increase in consumer awareness, increases in GDP per capita, greater understanding of the market, and so forth. Now, these are the implied prices, simply derived by looking at the import volumes and the import values. Relatively straightforward exercise to do. And you can see that although there are some outliers in this information, which are probably caused by individual contract differences, because these are all made up of, these imports are actually individual contracts. That's what's making these things up. They're not a continuous stream of dried fruit at a given price. These are averages of the contracts that have actually been issued over the period. But you can see there's a wide variation. And perhaps one of the reasons why people have been nervous about launching substantial exporting drives to China is because, and over time, we checked in every year, you can see that the price that the Chinese pay for dried fruit imports is significantly lower than the price paid in Europe. So the attraction of the European market superficially is that you can get a much better price per kilo for your dried fruit. But that relies on you actually succeeding in penetrating those import markets. Whereas it's much easier to get into the Chinese market, at least at the moment. As we'll see, China is tightening its standards, bringing them more closely in line with international values. And the window of opportunity for exporters to move into the Chinese market might start to close at some point if efforts are not made in the next 10 years maximum, I would say.
Julian, what's going on with India's price there at 432?
Yes, I mean, probably because the volumes are relatively low. We looked at that too. Sorry, I'm interrupting in times, of course, because that's saying. If we think that the reason is either reporting error of one variety or another, or possibly the composition of the dried fruits that came in, or possibly, and I think most probably, it's individual contract reporting information that's slightly off. I wouldn't completely trust that. I do know that the Indian price varies a fair bit over time, so I wouldn't necessarily count on that one. But I think in general, yes, you sort of can say that the Indians tend to import at the top end. To some extent, imported dried fruit is a little bit on the expensive side, and that's probably got something to do with it, I think, in this exercise. Oh, I dropped it. Yeah, thank you. So those are the kinds of, but you can see that there's a fair degree of outliers and a degree of sort of standardization across the pattern. And that's where we're looking at in terms of the import. These are fairly sizable markets, but of course, if you were to compare them to a big global commodity market like maize or rice or something, these would be tiny values, of course, and that's another factor.
if you were to sort these prices, I think you'd get like a European price, a Scandinavian price, and an Indian price, because it's almost with one price works.
Yeah.
In Europe.
It's quite close, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's quite close. Absolutely. But I think that Indian one is an outlier. And I think you can't always rely on statistics from the ITC to be completely accurate. And I think over time we find that would even off. But yes, you've got plenty of European data. It sort of comes together in producing this. Right. So this is where Uzbekistan sends its dried grapes. And so you can see the problem for Uzbek dried grape exporters immediately. Their principal market is China, and therefore the amount of money they receive per kilogram, per ton of dried grapes is way lower than that received in Turkey. And what can you do with all that money? Well, of course, you can invest in all the things that you need to invest in. There's your problem in a nutshell of fruit co. And Kyrgyzstan, possibly a conduit, given the variations from year to year, and Turkey likewise. But these exports, as we'll see, have been showing substantial increases to Russia, United Arab Emirates. These are real, actual, genuine export markets where opportunities actually might lie. And this is a significant proportion. I was trying to remember exactly what the proportion of the grape markets actually are. The UNCTAD paper, of course, has them, but they form a significant proportion of UNCTAD of Uzbekistan's overall fruit exports itself. About a quarter, something like that, are dry. And agricultural exports themselves are vital to Uzbekistan. And of course, they're trying to diversify and do all those good things that every economy is trying to do with the assistance of the World Bank and so on. So this is important from a macroeconomic point of view in Uzbekistan, not just from a sectoral point of view. A lot of employment runs off this and so on. So this is the slide I was talking about. So this shows you where the increases are actually coming from. And you can see that some of these markets, Saudi notably, but others are beginning to show increases. I think anyone would say that trend was moderately positive. And the question really is whether it's possible to make it even more positive. Undoubtedly, one of the things that comes to mind from an ethical point of view about all of this is that arguably this is a zero-sum game. If Uzbekistan wins, somebody else loses. But it's not quite like that. One, because the market is increasing overall anyway. So it's a question of who gets a rising pie, both because population numbers are increasing and because of the switch in consumers' interest. But also because I think there's a point at which the value per kilogram and the total imported, the total value being able to be reinvested has reached a point where you get consumer surplus. And Turkey is at that point. They can't get more efficient in terms of their drying or their refining operations. They're pretty close to that position now. There may be individual farms that can improve, but they've got a lot of money. Whereas if you can push up all the others, this is the UNCTAD argument, if you can push up all the others, including Uzbekistan, they really are at a much steeper point on the curve. And therefore you put more money into their hands and you're actually get real improvements in processing and so forth. And the people who don't want this, of course, are the Turks, for obvious reasons. So where are we now? These are the conclusions that Rodrigo came to. This is his set of conclusions. Europe imports almost half. Uzbekistan doesn't export very much to Europe. Lots of high growth or high prices and so forth. Considerable lags elsewhere, but very high mandatory and commercial standards, which I'll be returning to a little bit later on. Significant penetration in some markets. Others, particularly Turkey, strong brands. They're on top of the phytosanitary side of things, and they have established business links. And those are the three big challenges. So the question now comes, how do you potentially overcome those challenges? Right. UNCTAD's approach, as I mentioned, was to approach this on a dual track layer of consultancy, if you like. On the one hand, what can Uzbekistan do internally to improve things? And on the other hand, what can Uzbekistan do in respect of its exports? So twin tracking was our approach to this. And trying to bring those twin tracks together is difficult. So this is what Jazavek had to say. The domestic value chain impacts on the quality of dried fruit produce. And did he find that it did? If you ever want a case in point as to why agricultural value chain analysis matters and why the work that goes on here matters and so forth, and why I'm so passionate about it, this is it. And these are the kinds of problems that are faced. So a field survey was done. This is where it was done. Yazabek did a superb job of going up there and talking to everyone and mobilizing local recruiters and so on. Of course, he spoke the local language, which was vital in this particular case. As we all know, you do field surveys, you have to have that. So these are the kinds of areas, and it was all done as field surveys ideally should be in a relatively compressed period of time to get all the information that was required. And the UNCTAD paper has how many farms and where they were situated and what the size distribution of the farms were and how many different types of dried fruit they produce, and all that kind of information is all there.
So what's that chart showing? Why is it
that shows that just shows how many of the different regions of what's produced in the different regions. That's what that's about. These are the various producing regions that were looked at. And so they started here and they moved through and did those regions one after the other. And there was the number of hectares that they covered in each of the surveys. Sorry. Okay. More detailed information on that is available in the UNCTAD paper as to exactly how it broke down, the size distribution particularly, which was found to be very important. This is what they found when they looked at the farms. It was a dismal picture, quite frankly. No certification. And if you don't have certification, how are you going to break into the European market? No even understanding of what global gap was for the majority of the farmers. They all knew that quality was very important, but they had no idea that quality was something which was objectively managed by standards. As far as they were concerned, quality was something that people perceive subjectively, as they have done for 1,000 years or more. It was not something, and we know this, right, from our experience in other markets, it was not something that you could actually measure. And so this was all complete, not so much anathema, but just very strange to farmers who produce things in a particular way. On the other hand, as you can see, almost half of them had difficulty supplying the required quality in the first place. So even the subjective quality wasn't being met. So why? Well, we'll look at some of those reasons generally, but in the next slide as to what some of the problems actually were. But given the rise, if you superimpose on top of all this statistical information, the fact that within each of these markets, organic fruit, dried fruit, is growing as well, that is a double-layered challenge. And they're not even on the starting blocks as far as meeting that challenge is concerned. They've no idea how to do it. So they don't understand these issues, the pest and disease controls, don't understand or analyze correctly what the implications are. The fact that they're not receiving the additional value at that point in the value chain from moving towards organic is critical, of course. The buyers are not prepared to pay, so why should they invest if they're not going to get paid for it? And the fact that there isn't any local markets for organic produce in the country either, nobody would be interested in. So those are major obstacles to moving down that way. And they didn't have, even those who said they didn't have the knowledge, probably didn't. So organic is one step beyond in terms of problems and problematics at the farm level. Other critical issues, drying and quality. So these are the critical issues. The farmers sell both, right? So they have to make a decision about what they're going to dry. They have a storage issue. Typical, we would be familiar with futures markets, right? They have a period that they have to dry the fruit from. They have to gamble each time they do that they'll get a higher price after they've stored the dried fruit. They may or may not. So if they're short in terms of ready cash, working capital, then they're not going to dry in the first place. That's one argument. They don't necessarily, they try to use the best quality, but some don't. And if it doesn't meet the required quality, then of course it's not going to be bought. So some of it actually gets wasted. And as you can see, there's a conflict between trying to get high quality fruit for export, which is reasonably homogeneous in the quantities that people want, the buyers want, and trying to put some of it aside to dry. So there's a tension. They have an opportunity to use this mechanism of drying the fruit, but on the other hand, they have this problem. Now, the big issue, though, is the fact that they have sun drying. Traditional, old-fashioned sun drying, which only 5% using shade drying, and very, very little. And of course, this, I mean, I won't go into the details of it, but you can read that in the paper too. But sun drying is generally not advised. It's not the right way to do it. It runs significant risks. those who use sophisticated mechanisms tend to be concentrated in larger farms and all pretty much in one region. And they tend to use it for dried apricots because they're higher value. So you've got an elite, effectively. You've got your apricot farm, dried apricot people, and then you've got everybody else. And very little cold storage capacity, partly because of electricity problems, which might eventually go, and that's how much actually gets stored. So drying and storage is a major problem, which requires some kind of either centralized storage, warehouse storage, or some sort of loan program, which actually reach them specifically to improve storage, which the government has been reluctant to do, but which we have majorly encouraged them to do. They need to extend their extension services. They really do. They need to put out technical services to farmers. Of course, it's terribly easy to say this is what they need to do. It's a vast difference between actually getting this done. But this would be ideally what they do. And I don't suppose any of you here is remotely surprised about the advantages that extension services can provide. We're all aware of them, right? These are the things they can do. Better practices, new varieties, improve understanding of solutions, understand cash flows better. That's partly economic and it's partly technical as well. And probably more than anything else, getting them to understand exactly what the quality standards actually are, and then getting that traced through the value chain so they actually receive the benefit from doing what they do. It's no use telling them to do stuff unless they're going to get financially rewarded for it. And if you want export certification, the European Union, in its usual way, is trying to make sure that it gets its certification process to work right throughout the value chain, right down to the farm level. And that's no use for Uzbekistan if you can't get the farm certified. So they need actually to work with third-party independent certifiers who are approved by the European Union to go in there and give the tip to individual farms, probably starting in the main regions, possibly through gritty teeth, probably starting with dried apricots, and then extending it across the whole area. But that is a tension. So that's the idea. So the idea of the total quality roadmap is what's required. Do they have the political will? Do they have the resources? Are they capable of actually implementing this? That's the big question. We also think, and we recommend it to them very strongly, that it would be advisable if they set up producer groups to do these things. All of those things that they can actually do. They can do these things, get better prices, buy in bulk to reduce input costs, get some credit going effectively amongst producer groups. Working in cooperatives works, right? We all know the evidence is I think fair to say, overwhelming that collaboration between producer groups actually works. But this is what one actually needs to do. Look how small the producer area actually is on average. Of course, people like me would say, wouldn't it be better if these were all corporates? This was 600 hectares. Everyone worked for the corporate, and then they could really take on the certification problem and engage with the outside world. It's only all these little farmers, none of them with sufficient capacity to make any investments. They would all be better off if they worked together, but that's very difficult to do. And a halfway house might be to have some sort of producer group that they all work together and collaborate. We're better off together. And it really applies for dried fruits as for so much everything else. And of course, the imbalance of power between concentration of buyers and a huge diversification of farmers inevitably works to the disadvantage of the farmers in this regard. So producer groups would really help. Trade and quality. So these are the issues here. You can see the issues. And this is my point about the buyers themselves not being sufficiently educated, in fact, either. They're looking at how it feels, appearance and so on, weight and size, but they didn't look at really critical issues. And mycotoxin is a really important issue. And there are European regulations to control this. And it's been a major issue. There have been bans on imports from all sorts of countries with respect to these kinds of regulations, very, very much there. And of course, the buyers themselves, only a very small minority, but a fifth of them, actually get any form of certification themselves either. So you can't look to the majority of the buyers to push the farmers to implement certification because they're not certified either. So the process has to work right throughout the value chain, and the government has to do something. To be fair to the Uzbek government, they are aware of this. The question is, how do they actually make it happen? I'll push on. This is what we recommend they do. I've got 10 minutes? 5 minutes?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Okay, right. This is what we think they should do, right? This is the recommendation from Jazabek internally. Participate in the groups, keep databases, study the regulations, move to regulating the aflatoxin levels, perhaps a pilot to start with might actually work. And move to regulation here and consult the EU databases. These are potential useful actions. The reason why I say this is that there are a series of standards that the Uzbeks must adhere to if they want to succeed. And unfortunately for them, it's not just the mandatory standards, these things, which the EU mandates along with every other country, Australia, of course, and so on. Australia is very comfortable when it comes to exporting dried fruit or any fruit like this, because as a leading Australian exporter pointed out, we are confident in being able to meet all these standards all the time. So it actually benefits us here to have the highest possible standards because it will always be met, pretty well always met. But in countries like Uzbekistan, it's an enormous challenge. And the idea of introducing hazard analysis and so forth throughout the value chain, dealing with packaging, mandatory packaging requirements, the Germans, for example. Within the European Union, you've got layers of regulations. So you've got the EU regulations, then you've got national regulations underneath that. In some cases, you've even got regional regulations underneath those, as you do have, for example, in the UAE. Dubai's regulations not quite the same as Abu Dhabi's and so on. So packaging requirements also important, all of those things. The toxins too, those are the mandatory trade standards. If it stopped there, that would be fair enough, but it doesn't. On top of that, there's a whole series of commercial standards, which Turkey is very, very well aware of. So things like moisture and size, each individual supermarket, Tesco's, Aldi, and so forth, all have their own buyers, their own requirements, and so forth. These are very dedicated people who work as buyers for these supermarkets, who want to provide good quality fruit and dried fruit for their customers. Same thing with the companies that produce this stuff, Sunkist and the others who did this kind of thing. Plenty of food certification systems, no shortage of systems and certs, just the difficulty of actually getting people to adopt them and actually do something about them. And very, very few companies, only 2 or so in Uzbekistan that we found, who actually could understand production to international standards. Needless to say, the big ones concentrated in Tashkent and the other locations. So they're all in the big cities. They're the ones who know what they're doing. And that's what I've suggested, that what we're looking at. It's a game. It's a complicated game where there are rules of the game. And the Turkish exporters not only know these rules, but their grandfathers and their fathers helped build the rules of the game over the past 50 years. So of course they understand what they're doing. So breaking into that market is going to be tough. And these are the kinds of things that I've suggested would be useful here. So testing regularly, banning some things, actually having the courage to go and ban things that are going to be problematic. Testing, dialoguing with the importers, talking to them. The most difficult people to talk to in all of this were the importers. My job to try and talk to importers. They had no reason to talk to anyone. They didn't particularly want to talk to UNCTAD. They're not impressed by government agencies or governments or anybody else. We managed to get their views, and they did grudgingly admit that they had worked with the Turks for a very, very long time, and that getting to work with other people would be an enormous challenge. And random checks, other things that we can potentially do in the system. These are recommendations that I gave to the Uzbek government as to what they should actually be doing. Database of procedures so that everyone's got access to it. The Exporters Federation, like they have in Turkey for dried fruits. There's a dried fruit exporters association in Turkey. They need the same thing in Uzbekistan if they're going to compete. And then work with the development agencies to get the laboratories actually on the ground in Uzbekistan so that they can start testing them there. They can see what's actually required. And then keep up to date with all the statistics and everything else that's needed. It's a huge challenge. And it can't be done just by bureaucrats sitting in their offices. What's the prize at the end of it? If they can start this process in parallel, they could then start, and this is my argument, and I will come to a close. This is the argument. If they did this, they could copy Turkey, follow the track. They don't have first mover advantage, but they do have all the advantages that a follower on does in a marketplace. They can learn from experience and learn what needs to be done. There is such a thing. I don't know how many of you are aware of the idea of dried apricots and Turkey going together in the mind, but it certainly does in Europe. If you think about dried apricots, you think Turkey. Now, my argument is, and this is my concluding point, that if Uzbekistan put the effort in, you can't easily be a brand leader in dried apricots, and at the same time become the brand leader in dried grapes. Not easily done. Best in coupes, best in utes, doesn't quite work. So the opportunity exists for Uzbekistan long term, and the prize is enormous to start now to copy Turkey, but take dried grapes instead of dried apricots, concentrate where it appears to be least advantageous on the dried grape market and meeting Chinese standards and Indian standards and Russian standards. Go with the future rather than the past, if President Biden will excuse me. And 20 years from now, the rewards for Uzbekistan could be very, very substantial. But the time to start ideally would have been 10 years ago. But if you start now, you have a chance to do something unique so far as Central Asia is concerned. That's the recommendation we have for the Uzbek government. And for myself, I sincerely hope they take it up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Julian, well, it's a technology that I'm somewhat skeptical of at this point. But is there any thought about Uzbekistan perhaps doing some technological leapfrogging and adopting blockchain technology for traceability?
Right, good, yeah. Not yet. Okay. The World Bank has a series of projects out there in terms of ease of trade. And Uzbekistan is quite low on that list. To get the necessary certificates to export out of Uzbekistan requires 7 stamps as opposed to 3 stamps, whatever it happens to be. Down the road, yes, but I think that's a question that really needs to be addressed not just to the dried fruit export trade, but to the whole of Uzbekistan's commodity exports and wider. And the World Bank is trying to do that with all of the Central Asian countries, as it is with many others. So the answer is to your question is yes, absolutely, but it's above our pay grade as far as dried fruit is concerned, and the problem really rests with the World Bank. But ultimately, yes, it's all part of the prize.
And that's the same discussion that I've had with my students about it. Is we're not quite there yet, but
one day,
but it's something on the horizon.
And it's a great level too. Once it's done, interconnecting contracts like that with certification, definitely the way forward. No, I completely agree with you, but we're not there yet.
Okay, those of you online, sorry, Ben. Faye, can you speak so that we know you are able to speak? Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, we can hear you. That's good. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone online have a question? Okay, that's okay. If you have, let us know. Ben.
I wonder if an alternative strategy for the Uzbeks is to actually focus on China, because rather than try to compete with Turkey, because there's just a huge, seems to have a huge sort of hold on the market.
Absolutely.
And Europe is always difficult and expensive to deal with because of the biosecurity concerns. So, but I mean, China will develop, and the Uzbeks will have to develop in the same way, because China's going to say we don't want.
They are already saying.
Yeah.
So if you so effectively you compete for China, you get the Chinese market, and Europe falls into your lap anyway. Because by the time you've reached the point at which you're easily able to compete into the Chinese market, the Chinese standards will come up to pretty much the same levels as the European ones anyway. So if you focus on meeting the Chinese standards constantly and work with the Chinese, because unlike Europeans, they will help you reach the standards, as opposed to try actively to stop you reaching the standards, because they have their own farming interests to look after, particularly with Greece, which is actively involved in dry grape production. So if you work with the Chinese, they're likely to encourage that process. And as I say, eventually the prices will start leveling, and you'll be able to import into Europe. Because to be fair to the European Union, provided you meet the standards, you've dealt with that hurdle. And then once the European Union importers start to see that these things are happening over in China, eventually they will start copying what happens in China, and therefore they will be keen to import. So I completely, and that's what we recommended to them. Go for the Russian market, go for the Chinese market, maybe the Indian market as well, build those up, and then worry about Europeans down the road.
Is there anything about these great, these raisins that make them any better or worse than any other raisins?
Oh, I'm sure Uzbek grapes and raisins are tasting much better than their competitors. I'm sure they have a unique flavour and quality to them. They certainly, I would say probably that, that because Uzbekistan's dry grape production is spread over a number of different areas, they certainly have a fair degree of reliability of supply, which is certainly something that importers will be pleased to see. That is certainly the case. But other than that, I can't say, because of course, in many cases, you never know when you're consuming Uzbek dried apricots or dried grapes.
So you haven't done the tasting.
So I can't say I've done the tasting yet. So had we been in a more fluid travel environment, I would have myself gone over to Uzbekistan as part of this, but I was unable to do so, which is a matter of great regret. But Jazabek can probably comment on that better than I can.
Yeah. Any question, Ron? Yeah.
Julian, I think this question is a little bit off what you discussed, but you alluded early on that how these landlocked countries should need to think about export market on some of the commodities.
Yeah.
So how would it differ if it would have been different countries?
Okay. Part of the project involved not actually working on, but reviewing the work was done on tariffs, on rail transport, on the development of the rail network to China, on the cost of land transport to Kazakhstan, those kinds of actual transport costs. We all know that transport costs are a very significant element of this exercise, and so that matters. We know that sea transport is generally cheaper. So transport costs are a major element of this, but again, above my pay grade as to why they decided to pick on landlocked countries. I think because there was a concern about the relative cost of transport for relatively small quantities of particular commodities, and there are African countries, of course, in the same situation. And so I think that was UNCTAD's motivation for wanting to do it. But you're right, and it's in there in all the papers, because of course of the landlocked sort of program title. The transport issue is very real and addressed in all of those questions. Absolutely.
There are a couple of questions on the chat lines. If observe.
Oh yes.
Yeah. If you.
Right. Okay. So Faye, yes, the government supporting building certification in principle, the government is in favour of doing it. Yeah. But there isn't a coherent program yet in place to go and make it happen. They're supposedly working with the European Union to make this happen, but they're only at the stage at the moment, Faye, of building awareness of certification. They're not yet in the process of actually implementing it, but hopefully in the next few years, there will be a real program to make that happen. So watch this space, I'm afraid, is the answer just at the moment. But hopefully we've given some impetus to that process through our project.
Just on that, there's one question that has been coming to me again and again. How important is the dried fruit export to the country? Why is it not investing in it if it's important?
I think there's a level at which exports have to reach before you get a really significant capital import. Cotton, there's no doubt about that. Everyone puts effort into that. Yeah. But I mean, we can see the same thing here. I mean, there are other examples of minority crops where it's difficult to get the same incentive. And there's an economy of scale issue when you're dealing with cotton by comparison to dried fruits. The certification process still needs to be launched, all the same costings, all the same deliberations, the same investment. It's difficult to get that momentum going when there are so many competing influences. And I think also they were starting to think about all of this really seriously when COVID hit. That's the other factor. So I think they will come back to this, and I think they do now recognise that they need to do it. Yes.
Second one from us, Jeff.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, we did. Or Jazabek looked at that. Data is a bit scarce to do it really, really well. But the general view was that in terms of the Uzbek government themselves, I was actually revising the papers last night, the Uzbek government themselves has this data. And their view is that the comparative advantage does indeed lie with dried grapes. So they agree with us. the resource costs are lower in that area. That's a further argument. In terms of relative competitiveness, Uzbekistan is in a better position, both domestically and I think internationally, and the two could act synthetically together. So yes, and that's on the website, Azjad. If you look at the presentation by the Uzbek government, you'll see, if you just type in Uzbekistan dried fruits UNCTAD, you get the relevant page. You see the presentation by the Uzbek government representative at the seminar, and you'll see that the domestic resource cost and comparative advantage is specified there as well. So yes.
Is there any effort by private sector to get into this market? For instance, developing private standards that can be applied. This all is completely neglected by the private sector.
Yeah, I think the standards thing is now it has now become a competition between different standards outfits, and they have tremendous resources behind them. So the private sector is now in a tandem relationship with the standards bodies. You set the standards, you make them incredibly complicated, you make them really difficult to follow, and that'll be absolutely marvelous. We'll be completely independent from you. And then we'll go and tell the farmers why they must adhere to these standards, and we'll make lots of money out of the certification process. And everyone benefits more. They accept the farmers actually, of course, on the ground who have to go and adhere to these things. And the consumers presumably benefit from it. But it's really tough for farmers in Uzbekistan to try to ask them to adhere to standards that they really don't understand, have not been presented to them properly. And of course, the standards setting organizations take absolutely no responsibility for outreach to the farmers themselves with the standards. They just set them and stand back from them.
Okay, so
it's up to FAO and others to get on the ground and try and do this exercise. But it was notable that we didn't find an FAO outreach program in this area in Uzbekistan.
So all of it is just small scale by farmers. We don't have anything like private farms.
We do. There are three different types of farms in Uzbekistan. The Deccans are the largest, and they are the ones that are commercially viable, essentially. They're the ones that do have some standards. They're the ones that have the better relationships with buyers, and they're the ones, of course, that Chinese importers and Indian importers prefer to deal with, because they're more reliable in terms of their standard. They're easier to deal with. They understand the commercial terms as well as the standards that they require. And so it's much easier to deal with them than smaller exporters. So there are some, but as I say, firms that have actually actively engaged in this in Uzbekistan, just two.
So, one more question. Okay. So, what efforts you think would be better for integrating the small farms and into the scale of production?
My personal view, I think that the more M&A we get, the better. Now, you know my view on this. We need to bring them together and get them into larger groups. And the only way I can see this happening in the short to medium term is through collaboration, as I say, through producers groups. That's the only practical way it's actually going to happen. Over time, we will probably see more large-scale commercial enterprises developing with better access to capital, more access to risk management, better understanding of quality issues, and able to engage with the outside world. But in the short to medium term, the buyer and more vertical integration as well, of course. That's the other point. But for the time being, I think producers groups, exporters association, talk to one another under the auspices of the government. You've got a reasonable chance of getting somewhere. We can kick off that way anyway, and maybe other things will come in due course.
Okay, great. Please join me in thanking Julian for the next presentation. Thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.